Okay. So in terms of evolution,
if 50,000 years ago we as Homo sapiens were one rabbit that we could, one rabbit would do. We can get to lunchtime, light the fire, have a nice meal. Oh, this is magic. We'll start again in the morning. If it was only 50,000 years ago, have we evolved in terms of our mental structures and everything else to the state we are now, which is we just can't cope with one rabbit. It does our heads in, and we're in a terrible mess. We're shaking, and we're depressed, and we're God knows what else. So is that an evolutionary thing where we can't cope with the thought of we've only got one rabbit, or is this something we do to ourselves from birth because we've been brought up in a society that doesn't require us to worry about the rabbits this morning? And is that something? So how do we get to the point where we can't cope with just having one rabbit? Is it evolutionary or is it nurture?
Personally, I think it's culture. I mean, the human brain hasn't evolved very much in the last 40,000 years at all. But our structures and our society has evolved enormously. But it's tended to evolve on the basis that the most successful have the most resources. Therefore, there's always a race to the top in terms of resources. You know, we've had this conversation in the past about always wanting a little bit more.
Yeah, but it all actually takes us to that discussion about survival of the fittest and aren't we genetically predisposed to that little bit more and all that stuff?
Yeah, I'm sure we are. I mean, most organisms tend to rely on biological fitness, and that the biologically fittest species tend to be the ones that survive, and the ones that can't adapt to a new environment tend to die out. Unfortunately, I think the human brain rather changed all of that, because we are by far and away poorly prepared for survival from a fitness point of view. We've got feeble bodies, we haven't got strong jaws, we've got rubbish claws, we can't run very fast. There is nothing going really for the human body, but the human brain changed the game simply because we began to think about how we became able to think and be able to kind of predict a little bit about our future, or to think about what might be more beneficial for us as individuals. But I think the evolutionary aspect of that has failed dismally, because it hasn't evolved into what would it look like if I did catch 5 rabbits, but I gave 4 of them to my neighbours, because it's much more about me hanging on to and making a profit out of my neighbours with the other 4 rabbits.
Yeah, but we only need our neighbours for survival. That's the only reason we're kind to our neighbours. The only reason we have societal structures is in order to survive. If we felt that we could survive without them, would we have evolved to have social structures in the first place?
That's an interesting question. It's a good question. Clearly, herd activity was more effective than individual activity, and certainly we know that from studies of kind of more simpler organized groups of human beings around the world, where communal activity tends to be much stronger. And if somebody transgresses the rules of the group, then the group tends to take responsibility for the removal, one way or another, of that individual. I mean, there are cases where everybody went and there was somebody committed a murder, everybody in a particular group went and beat that person with a stick. So they all took collective responsibility for the death of that person.
If we take a step back before then, we started to interact with our neighbours because the mammoth was too big, but it was a good source of meat. So we started to interact with them because we could attack it together and get some meat that way. We started to interact with our neighbours because the saber-toothed tiger, we couldn't defend ourselves against saber-toothed tiger, but if there was 20 of us, then we probably could.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering how this, we have a societal structure in order to survive, and survival is underpinned by the need for a little bit more, as we've discussed before.
Well, let's just turn all that on its head for a minute. Let's just say that initially that was the process, that communal activity, working together, killing the saber-toothed tiger, killing the bison or whatever else it was, required cooperation and community in order to be effective. But then when groups got a little bit bigger, or individuals saw an opportunity to manipulate a group in order to develop their own individual situation, then rather than the group being cooperative, the group becomes competitive, because that's advantageous for those people who can take advantage of that competitiveness.
So are you saying that competitiveness is a result of community, society?
Wow.
In other words, we don't need it if we haven't got it.
Yeah, I don't think we do need it if we haven't got it. But I think the nature of the human brain is such that we produce a huge range of individual personalities that range from those that are prepared to manipulate and deceive for their own benefit, to those people who would deny themselves an existence in order for the benefit of others. And we have every single kind of personality in between. But it's those
and each of us has a little bit of each.
Yeah, to a greater or lesser extent. It's a spectrum, to coin a phrase.
Yes. So you introduced me to the word striving in the context of the human brain, because we were talking about contentment and how does striving actually sit with contentment. So what is striving in this context? So I'm in a societal group, or I'm on my own because I'm a loner, but the societal group is sitting next door. But I've got a fundamental. Is it a fundamental urge to strive? Because it's the striving, isn't it, that leads to competitiveness and leads to those other human traits, no?
Well, it doesn't only lead to competitiveness, it can also lead to cooperativeness.
Yeah, sure, it can lead to all sorts of things, but I'm just wondering, is striving in this context just a basic human nature that we all need to strive? We all need to strive, and then you come down to the definition of what striving actually means. Is it the same thing as competitiveness? Is it the same thing as selfishness?
Well, no, I would put it in the context of survival.
Right. I think that's probably right. So can you expand on that a touch?
Yeah. The thing is that we all seek to survive as comfortably as we possibly can. And some people are prepared to do it at the expense of others, and other people are prepared to do it at the expense of themselves. But they're both striving to achieve something. I mean, ironically, I was listening to the. I was reading a report from the British Psychological Society this morning about stress in Parliament, And no, it wasn't. It was a newspaper article I was reading. But there was this psychologist that came up and said that Boris Johnson is now failing to take the tough decisions because he really wants to be loved. And so he's not prepared to be unpopular. So his behavior, his striving, is modified by a more basic need to be accepted, or to be, in the words of the commentator, loved. So his striving to be loved produces activity, which is also tempered by his desire to be a politician, and in this case, Prime Minister.
But the basic word that underpins all of this is the word striving. The fact that he's striving for love as opposed to the next guy who's striving for another billion,
yeah,
and doesn't care whether he's loved or not, it's still underpinned by a basic human nature to strive that little bit more.
Yeah,
it's a little bit more of whatever it is that he likes, and if that's a basic human nature.
Yes, I think so. I think there is a drive to be active most of the time, and when we become depressed, when we become depressed particularly, but anxious to some extent, then that striving is compromised, because it becomes either too frightening if we're anxious, or too demanding if we're depressed.
And here is the question that we started with. When I was a young lad and I only needed to get one rabbit.
The image of you chasing a rabbit is it's somewhat amusing.
But you can see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
I was striving for the one rabbit, and my missus was striving for that feeling that I'm not going to be attacked, or if I am, and I'll have some food because my husband's gone out to get it, and I've lit the fire and the babies are okay. And I came back at lunchtime with the rabbit, and we started cooking it. And there wasn't any, at that time, there wasn't theoretically there, but was there any anxiety about tomorrow? Surely not. Surely at that stage in our evolution, there was no anxiety about tomorrow caused by striving, because I'd actually ticked that box. I'm happy as Larry, I've got there. Yeah, tomorrow morning I'm going to be striving again because I'm hungry, but I haven't got any. And the question we started this with is, how did we get to today in evolutionary terms? How did we get to today where not knowing where the rabbits are coming from and all that stuff about tomorrow, the day after that, we're anxious about it. Whereas back then, I don't think we were we?
Probably not. I think we don't even need to go back that far to be kind of, for the vast majority of the population, to be worrying about tomorrow, because they're still worrying about today.
Correct. So I'm just, the original question was, is this an evolution of the human species, or is it an evolution of our psychology that's been brought on by the nurture that we receive from being a baby and being brought up in the society we currently have? And of course, I'm talking about it in the context of Western society.
Yeah, and we could narrow that even further and talk about the British society, the United Kingdom, I believe that the profound turning point, certainly for this country and probably for most of the Western world, was the end of the Second World War. But particularly in this country, where we developed a free National Health Service, and phrases like "we will take care of you from the cradle to the grave" began to appear in the popular press, because it set a direction. It made an assumption that people were going to be cared for from the cradle to the grave. So it made the nature of striving somewhat different. It didn't mean we didn't have to strive, but we strive within the context of a nurturing society that would take care of us if we were failing to strive, or we were unable to strive.
So what is it? Are you saying it's a whack-a-mole? We bang that bit down. Don't worry about your health, mate. We'll look after you. but because of that innate need to strive, to survive, to be even better and even better again, another thing pops up. Okay, I didn't worry about my next billion before National Health Service came along, but because I've got the National Health Service, I can worry about the next billion, or I can worry about making sure my child's education is better than yours.
Yeah. It becomes, the things become less and less existential and more intellectual.
So again, back to survival, I was worried about building a wall. That was my first thing. And I didn't worry about anything else because the wall was the most important thing, because I was getting attacked on a daily basis. I build my wall, then I start worrying about other things.
Yeah.
About security. Then I start to worry about the next thing. So is it a pyramid of concern, or in this context, a pyramid of striving? We still put all our energy into striving, but it's coming towards the top of the Maslow triangle as opposed to the bottom of it.
Interesting point. My immediate response to that is that, yes, I think it is a pyramid, but if you like, but I think I'd much rather use the idea of a chicane or a gorge, as Paul Martin suggested in The Canyon of the 21st Century, where to start with, the water is flowing slow and smooth and is shallow, and it's predictable, and you can sail on it safely. But as we get closer and closer to this pinch point, the water begins to get deeper and faster and more unpredictable. And the thing is that the real issue is not actually our existence, but actually how much more that we need, or we think we need, to have that existence. And that is predicated very largely on the process of collecting as much money as possible, in the belief that that creates security. But the more money that we have, the more insecure that we become. And there's now increasing research around the wealthy and their higher levels of insecurity than those people who actually have nothing.
So why do we do it?
I think because at the present moment, we've set, and again, this comes back to the way our society has been created, that rather than recognizing that security comes from community and cooperation, we believe that security comes from owning a vast sum of money or physical and material goods.
Yeah, but that's only because we feel that society is looking after us, that the society we live in, the laws, the government, and everything else gives us a feeling of security, that we don't have to worry about that. It's all legislated. All we need to do now, we're right at the top of the pyramid, is enjoy ourselves, have fun, enjoy ourselves, go on holiday. And we need money to do that, so we'll strive. But we're striving to enjoy ourselves because all of those other things are in place because our ancestors put them in place for us.
Well, I don't think that's true. I think it's much more ephemeral than that. I think people are much more frightened of losing that education. I think they're much more frightened of losing that security. I think they've become, we're looking at walled villages where people hide behind walls again, literally. And they'll spend vast sums of money in order to achieve that. But that, to me, really indicates an insecurity, not a security where we're able to enjoy ourselves, but that means that we need to strive harder because the structures we've built are more unstable and require more effort to maintain them. And certainly that's been absolutely clear during the pandemic.
Do you honestly think that there is a significant proportion, let's not sweat the detail on what that means, a significant proportion of the people that populate Great Britain that are worried about the structures more than they're worried about their holiday? Sorry, why did I say holiday? Holiday.
The point is that it's a question of scale, isn't it? Whether you're insecure, whether you're worried about whether you can have your holiday or not, or whether you can have your chateau in Monaco or whatever else. It is only a question of scale. The anxiety about being able to have that holiday and the insecurity of your employment or your income, let's put it that way, in order to be able to have that holiday, is increasing exponentially. I mean, we know that 1 in 4 of the population is significantly anxious, and I use that word rather than clinical.
Yeah, but the anxiety is about the myth of certainty and that there isn't one, or rather the certainty that they think they have is not going to provide them with the end result that they always thought they'd get. And that end result, again, is measured in terms of happiness and the things that money buys, in their view. What I'm saying, therefore, is that you predicated your discussion, your argument, on the basis that people are worried about the actual structures themselves, society itself, and the way it functions. And I don't see that.
I don't think I said that. I don't.
No, you didn't. I'm saying what I think you said. You're absolutely right.
It's because what I said was that I think that society is becoming more and more unstable and more unsustainable. I'm not suggesting that the vast majority of people are even considering the greater structures.
Okay, sorry, I misunderstood you. I misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, there are clearly people who are worried about the structures and about the nature of society. That's why we're constantly writing reports about what's going on. But the reality of it is that most people worry about it in the context of their own lives and their own insecurities, whether it's their kids' school, whether it's the nursing home for their parents, whether it's their job security, whether it's the very nature of the environment that they live in. They're not thinking about the psychological aspects of their environment necessarily, but what they are worried about is whether there's somebody in the next street that's going to come around and rob them.
Yeah.
Or beat up their kids.
It's pre and during COVID, the discussion that now comes to, because we're saying that COVID has made people start to come down the pyramid a step. So they were worrying about the things you just mentioned. Will I have enough money to look after my parents? Will I have enough money to send them to the kindergarten? Because I want to be happy. I want to have the things that money buys. And I need to do that as well. So I need to earn more money in order to do it.
Yep.
COVID comes along and puts anxiety in their minds, because that certainty that the base level from which they were being concerned has just come down a touch. So I've now got a bigger amount of things to be worried about. It's no longer certain that I'm going to have a job, and it's no longer certain that the money will come in as I thought, and it's no longer certain that I'll be able to look after my kids the way I had previously assumed. So having come down that notch, we've suddenly seen a significant increase in anxiety in the society.
Yeah, and there is some evidence. The Economist yesterday morning, published a document about suicide across the world, which suggests that there is much higher levels of suicidal ideation, because they're saying that it hasn't translated into deaths yet, but the study suggests that there's much higher levels of suicidal ideation since the beginning of COVID. And that this is likely to increase in the next phase of the disease.
So I'm still coming back to a question which I think we might have answered, but I'm not sure yet, which is, how did we as Homo sapiens get to the point where this slight, let's be honest with it, this slight drop in base level, if you compare it to the one rabbit scenario, how did we get as a society where that slight drop in society causes us to have a change in our psychology, that adrenaline runs faster and all of the chemical releases that change in the brain to cause that anxiety? How did that happen? How did we get to that point? Why aren't we coping better with this slight drop? Because 300 years ago, if you'd have been able to say, yeah, well, you'll be able to look after your kids to this new base level and be able to look after yourselves as a society because of the NHS to this base level, we'd have been, wow, magic, no anxiety at all. In fact, you'd have been taking anxieties away. How did we get here?
Well, I think that introduces a new word. And that word is trust, or more accurately, distrust. Because I think that what's happened is that people weren't really aware of the myth of certainty that you and I have talked about so much. They just made these assumptions that they would lead their lives and they would get to their retirement. But what COVID has done has really highlighted the huge fractures in society. And bearing in mind that we're now talking about inequality being increased by this virus, where the elite become richer and the poor become poorer. And we've even got the Chancellor at the present time muting tax rises in the next 12 months, 2 years, which will by and large fall very heavily on the middle class and the poorer classes, simply because they're the ones that it's easiest to tax.
But what I'm doing in my head is I'm saying I'm struggling to understand how, as a species, we've got to the point where we can be anxious about something that 100 years ago, 200 years ago would have reduced anxiety. We still have got the NHS, we still have got societal structures. Of course, that it now means because of COVID that I'm going to have less for my retirement, or less for this or less for that, all measured in money, basically, and that's what causes the anxiety. How did we get to this point? Why aren't we like, oh, it doesn't matter, I've still got a rabbit?
Yeah, we've still got a rabbit at the moment, but I think that people are not necessarily looking at the rabbit today. Yes, they may be looking more at the rabbit today. Well, I'm all right today, but they're looking beyond the end of this pandemic. They're still looking forward, but they're not seeing that retirement. They're not seeing the security that they had prior to the pandemic.
So when I did catch 5 rabbits, and I gave myself a holiday, and I felt great about it. Have I become addicted to that feeling? How do you understand where my question, or is it not clear?
No, I get it completely.
Is it an addiction? Am I addicted to the new normal, which is 5 rabbits? So if I go and eat one, and I've now only got 4 rabbits, I'm starting to feel a bit anxious, and now I'm down to 3 rabbits because I've eaten another one, and I'm starting to think, well, maybe I should go out today and get another rabbit because I like 5 rabbits. So is it an addiction?
Yeah, I think it is, and I think that the more you have, the more addictive it becomes.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I realised in that statement that we were talking about, the myth of certainty, starts with what we're watching is people withdrawing from the emotional addiction to the myth of certainty.
Yeah.
I hadn't actually put it in this context. Yeah.
But it's true. That's true, that they are having to realize that myth, that certainty never really existed. You know, it's like that hit from heroin. You feel wonderful at the time, but then reality returns after you've come down.
Okay, so if what's happening is that the reason I'm feeling anxious today is because I believed in the myth that I'd be able to live a certain kind of life in my retirement, and this has come along to actually tell me that it was a myth, and actually I don't know what life I'm going to be living in retirement, I'm now feeling anxious because I became addicted to the myth. I became addicted to the vision of my certainty of the future. And that's what's causing me the anxiety. So basically what's happened is that my addiction has grown. The more I've had of it, the more I've become addicted to it.
Yeah.
The more I want it, the more I want this, and it builds and builds and builds and builds, as society does.
Yeah.
If that's right, Steve, let's now segue back to the other side of this conversation, which is the political side of it. which is the, well, we might not call it political, which is the equality bit, the bit that says that the elite become more elite because they get more of it, and there's disadvantage in society. How do you square it? How do you turn around to your expression, the elite? My expression for the purpose of this conversation is the successful ones.
Yeah. Okay.
In terms of striving and whatever else.
Yeah.
How do you balance that out? How do you change it? How do you change the axis on which society in the West has built itself over the last God knows how many, to the point where the addiction is so great, you don't even know that you're addicted to it?
Well, this is where, like any addiction, it becomes unsustainable. And sustainability, we are seeing movement in terms of many more organizations beginning to look at sustainability, their own sustainability. But they're having to question their own, if you like, motivations and their own reasons for existence. And they may say, well, a good example are the oil companies. They're all moving towards much more sustainable forms of power production. And they're looking at different ways of maintaining their existence, simply because they know that eventually, and not too far distant future, they're not going to have a product to sell if they don't change.
Yeah, and I can see that analogy working well in the context of a Western society that is constantly striving to be successful, elite, whatever. But I can't see that. I can't see what's driving that change in society, if there is one. I can see the drive and what's driving the need for an oil company to get into other products and to survive by finding some other economic benefit that it can provide. Where is the trigger for society to make those changes?
Well,
because we're all of us brought up from birth in this new normal bubble that says that we've got 4,000 bloody rabbits, and if we've only got 3,000, we crap ourselves. We need to get 4,000 again.
Yeah, but I think that what's changing is that there's a recognition now that society is going to change significantly, and the things what you've got to bear in mind is that even the elite rely on the rest of the population, the successful, if you like, rely on the rest of the population to purchase their services or products. Otherwise, they don't have any money.
Yeah. But I think we're saying that we as a society need to get value of one.
Yeah.
We need to get society to say, I've only got 3,000 rabbits. And actually, that's great. I did have 4, but 3 is fine. 3 is magic. I'm going to be content at 3. I'm not going to be striving for more than 3, because it means that these other guys over here, they're all going to have 2,000 rabbits each, and that's fine by me. But human nature, as we've just said, as we've just described, isn't going to allow me to want to do that, because what's going to make me think, great, I'm actually going to be anxious that I've only got 3,000 rabbits and I had 4.
Surely it would be far better. Here's the analogy for you. You might have 3,000 rabbits, but how many of them are going to be rotten by the time you come to eat them? And if I could guarantee that you would have a rabbit today, tomorrow, the day after, into the foreseeable future, then surely that would also enable you to say, well, actually, I've got my rabbit. Is there something else that I can strive at that might be more interesting rather than simply survival?
And some people do that, but they all individually decide how many rabbits makes them feel, this word, content. And they're all different.
Well, I disagree with that, because I don't think that that if everybody, I think everybody would like 4,000 rabbits, but some people maybe don't have the ability, if you like, I'm not sure that's the right word, that they're not as successful, in inverted commas, as some other people. So they never achieve 3,000 rabbits, but or 4,000 rabbits, but they're always striving for that number. They're not content with the number that they've got.
I just don't see that. What I see in society is people finding a place, a number of rabbits, which, yeah, I'd like some more, but actually, in order to feel content or happy or whatever, I want to go, what I'll do is I'll kind of settle for that many rabbits. I know there's a gap, but I'll fill that gap with other things, because I want to go and travel and see society and other cultures, and I want to read books, and I want to do other things. I want to go to the theatre. I want to go to the church. I don't know. There's other things that then come into the mix.
Yeah.
And I see people say, well, I've got my retirement. It's all kind of sorted in my head. I'm 68. I've got my pension fund. Now I'll spend time doing other stuff. I'll stop striving, in inverted commas, for more rabbits. I'll start striving for other things that give me pleasure. That's what I'm seeing. And the numbers of rabbits is different for everybody in terms of how they get to that place. There's always a gap. I accept that. There's always a gap. But nobody ever says, I've got enough rabbits, I can do with just one more. It's great. But when they then start to spend their time striving, or the human nature of striving, doesn't it diminish over time for some people?
Oh, I'm sure it diminishes over time. And the thing is that people who've managed to collect more rabbits or secrete them away in a safe place so that they don't rot, has increased, but it's now decreasing again. And the other thing is that you mentioned pension funds and things like that. Well, the argument that there is an argument there to say that actually they're still rotting rabbits, because there's been many occasions where pension funds haven't been worth anything when people have come to collect them.
Yeah, and back to the myth of certainty and what does money mean, and money's part of that myth. And I totally get that. What I think I'm trying to ask you is how you change society when we are mentally structured for striving, and when we're mentally structured to reference contentment, happiness, or whatever in the context of what exists now.
Okay. I mean,
how do you take it away from me? Because in order for you to have more rabbits, or whatever it is that makes you content and happy, you have to take some away from me in terms of this whole value of one discussion.
Yeah, leveling things up. I agree. The thing is that there is an irony here, because if we go back to our Stone Age situation, there were very few individuals. Most people had to live in a community. It was the only way they could survive effectively. And what we've developed in the last 30, 40 years is an incredibly individualistic society where each person is after their own 4,000 rabbits. And the reality of it is that what we're seeing is the collapse of that kind of process, because it isn't sustainable, because you can't have 8 billion people on the population all striving for 4,000 rabbits. And in your own words, we have winners and losers. Yeah. But the point is we have fewer and fewer winners and more losers. And that's not a sustainable position. And if you want to remain a winner, then you have to start thinking about how you can keep the losers happy.
Yes. And at the same time, you've got to start thinking about how to make the winners happy and losing what they've got.
Well, there is a very bold position there, is that if they become enough losers that gather together in a community and turn around to the winners and say, well, actually, if you don't help us out here, you're not going to have anything.
And isn't that where I'm sorry we've segued this conversation in a place which it's getting into rough territory for me.
Yeah, sure.
Isn't that where communism collapsed?
Yeah, absolutely. But that wasn't communism anyway. I mean, I'm not talking about communism.
I understand that, but I'm saying that isn't that the fundamental part of the problem in changing society? How do you change society when it becomes anxious the minute you take the minutest little bit away from it, and thereby making so many people unhappy, and all they want to do is get back to normal, post-COVID normality, please, which means, as we both know, can you give me back all the stuff I wasn't happy with before? Yeah. but I want it to look like before, please. I want that myth of certainty back, and you know, everything we're now doing is striving to get back to normal, you know, to where we were.
But what you're describing there is a population that is looking back at something that never existed. And what you have to begin to do is to think about creating a vision where there is possibility of security and survival in a meaningful sense.
Before you can do that, you have to actually get conscious acceptance that it didn't exist. And to do that, you have to make the population even more insecure.
Well, COVID has succeeded in doing that.
It hasn't succeeded. We're all still waiting for normal. We're all still planning our holidays for next year. We're all still sitting here saying, oh my God, this is mad, isn't it? You know, but by the middle of next year, we'll have injections, so we'll all be fine. Fine equals back to normal, back to where we were. Not back to actually where we were is also a myth.
But I think that's where I mean, I know you're teasing me, but I think...
No, I'm proud. I am genuinely pressing the discussion. The pivotal point is that I admire your worldview, and I would love to see that worldview have traction. But I'm looking at it in the context of the very simple psychology of how do I get somebody to do what I want them to do. And I'm saying that there's a problem. You haven't established the need yet.
Well, okay. You may well be right that there is insufficient proportion of the population that's recognizing that their existence as was is not possible to regain in the future.
Or sustainable, even if it is.
Yeah, or sustainable, even if it is. But the reality of it is we're now going into the toughest part of this particular pandemic.
Yes.
They're talking this morning about another 50,000 redundancies. They're talking about 4 million unemployed.
Absolutely.
And the thing that you're talking about here is great. I can book my holiday for next year. Well, actually, come next year, you'll probably find that the places that you want to go on holiday won't want you.
Yes, but right now, all we're doing is waiting for the injection so we can get back to normal. The psychological, if I'm allowed to do such a thing, the psychology of the Western world is, and I would say vast majority, is that let's get back to normal. Politics is about getting back to normal, or at least painting that picture, or feeding the myth that it's possible.
Yeah, what you're trying to do is you're trying to solve the problem. You're not trying to find a solution.
No, what I'm trying to do is to say that in order to put a solution in place, you have to establish a need. And at the moment, and I believe even when we get to 4 million unemployed, that you won't have established the need.
Okay. In other words, what you're saying is that society is going to have to break down significantly further for people to come to that reality point.
We have to, in order, sorry to put it in these terms, but in order to sell the product, the cure, the solution, the whatever it is that we think is the right thing for the future, in order to sell the product, people have to, in order to buy it, I have to know that I have a need. So in simple
or a desire.
or a desire or a benefit. A need leads to a benefit. And I used to use this analogy in another life, in another place. But before flat pack furniture was actually sold, can you imagine the conversation? Oh, do you know what I've got? I've got a load of screws and some chipboard, and it's already all. And all you have to do is actually stick the screws into the. Before anybody had ever seen a flat pack piece of furniture, be like, what are you talking about? Well, I've got a box, and it just comes in a box. It's great. And what you had to do is you had to establish a need. You had to turn around to the population and say, if you do this, you'll save a fortune of money. It's just, the difference in price is just unbelievable. And slowly but surely, people understood that if you buy flat pack furniture, so you've established a need for this strange box with screws in it. So you were able to then sell it. Here's a solution to a problem. How do I get a wardrobe that's, instead of being 500, it's 250 quid for the same thing? All right, put your own labor into it. Job done. Okay, I've sold the product. The problem that I think that exists in providing solutions to the bigger picture that you talk about and I admire, the problem that I have is that I'm not sure that even this is going to establish the need. It's going to sell the need and therefore the benefits.
Okay. What I would say to you is that around the world, there are places, and even in this country, there are places now that are beginning to look at these community type models and bringing them into place. And sometimes inside of the existing structures. I mean, there's Village in the City in Edinburgh, for a start, which is actually developing a community within the existing structures where actually the community, as a micro community, begins to work together. Cormac Russell has looked at communities all over the world that do this kind of thing. There's one in Brazil, Porto, can't remember the name of it, a whole city where this kind of process is going on. And people are beginning to look at these models. There was in Canada, there was the Mincom study where they gave everybody a basic income, and they looked at the way health improved, crime went down, creativity went up, community and communication, community and cooperation all improved. All of these things are now being looked at quite carefully. But what's not happening at the moment is that they're not being advertised in anything outside of really professional circles, because that is the last thing that the people, the elite, if you like, the successful ones, the last thing they want is to see communities that are relatively equal, because that destroys their sense of power and their wealth and their security.
And the vast majority of the population would go along with that. Because you talked earlier about what would happen if a band of these disadvantaged gets together and starts to turn around to the elite and say, no, we're not having it anymore. But that's not happening. It's not happening in a way that means that, the guy that runs the village in Edinburgh is standing for Parliament and he gets elected, because that's a model that people think is good and sustainable in the long term, because they don't see the need for that radical change. Not
yet, but it's growing. But having said
that, so how in a political debate, how do you make it grow faster? Because the speed of growth means it's 200 years away. For action. Well, so this is the point. Exactly the point I'm trying to make. So how do we get the not necessarily into a definitely not? Because here is a way of selling the need. Because if you have that, if you can sell the need, then you can have people pick up the product.
Yeah, the thing is like any product. If people see that they can benefit from it, then they will pick it up. And if you begin to see more and more communities that are actually apparently working better and more effectively, even within the particularly within the system, the current system, then people are going to start to buy into that simply because they want to be part of a success.
So we have a what. The what is that Edinburgh village, let's say. And that's what you need to be sustainable in the long term. So there is the answer to the question of what should we do? What is the model? The question we're now discussing is the how. How do you get that product, that model, into society quicker for the benefit of all?
Well, I think, again, this is about small steps. But the irony of it is not about, let's say it's not about, I mean, communities, yes, that's one aspect. But I mentioned energy earlier. And I mean, Boris Johnson has announced that he's going to have the whole of the UK powered by wind. Well, we could probably just put a big fan above Westminster and we'd have enough hot air to drive the turbine anyway. But the thing is, I mean, joking aside, the thing is that I think that's actually a very laudable idea. But I think rather than saying it needs to be wind power, it needs to be a multiplicity of green energies. And that includes the work that universities are doing on hydrogen power, that companies are doing on building hydrogen-powered planes and trains and cars and all the rest of it. And the key to that is that's another little island of sustainability. But the key thing is that it's like, I hate to use this expression, but it's almost like different blots of bacteria on a Petri dish that they actually are fed and they're able to feed and grow, and eventually they start joining up until you've got one single approach or one single organism.
What you're talking about is evolution as opposed to revolution.
Absolutely, yeah. I don't believe that revolution is the way to go. Right. I really don't.
So in an evolutionary context, whatever any government will do, it's just announced 10 years from now, everything will be wind powered. That's an evolution,
yeah,
in that particular area. But you would maintain that that's not enough and it's not fast enough.
No, I think
because we should have nitrogen. We should have nitrogen. We should do this. We should do that.
Hydrogen, not nitrogen.
Hydrogen.
Yeah. Hydrogen. You can try burning nitrogen if you like. It's an inert gas. If you can crack that one, well, no, actually we haven't. But it's the thing is that I think we need to look at these things in longer terms. But what we need to be doing, and what this government is not doing, and I think I've challenged various people in both parties about the idea of actually having enough imagination to be able to not to make huge changes or huge gestures. It's about sweating the small stuff. It's about making the small changes. It's about putting money, putting resources, putting people where the change can be made, and doing it in small ways.
Yeah. Any kind of planning, or rather any kind of objective that's worth achieving, requires a plan that's got some time to it.
Yeah.
If we make this step, then that step, then this step, we will get to the end point. I don't see any agreement on what that end point is, and therefore all the steps that are being taken are taking you in different directions and not leading you towards the end. And the reason that is because there's no collective agreement on what that end point should be. And unless you have some buy-in to what that end point should be, you're always going to get a political rift that says, no, we should be going in a different direction. So, which is why you've got 4 years of a Labour government taking in one direction, you've got 4 years of a Conservative government taking into another direction, and you've got the people sitting around, depending on how they're feeling every 4 years, 5 years, that will decide what actually happens.
Yeah, and that takes me back to the point I made earlier about what's happening is that governments currently are trying to solve problems, not seek solutions. They're not.
Okay. Governments are, and I think that's, if you substitute the word government for the population, then I would agree with you.
And the thing is that what's happening at the moment, and whether you agree with this position or not, I will quite freely stick my hand up and say that I am a socialist in inverted commas.
Oh my word!
I know that's a terrible thing to say in this current light, but the reality of it is that unless we begin to think about what a sustainable future, not for us, not even possibly for our children, but for our children's children, until we start thinking about what their sustainable future looks like, and until such times as we can begin to move towards that sustainable future and actually agree that it is more about the future rather than the present, which basically, again, you mentioned this idea of 4 years on, 4 years off, whichever way round you want to look at it, I don't really care. The point is that short-termism and the problem solving within those 4 years prevents any real change. And the change that does come is because scientists, university people, populations, even individuals within populations, smaller populations, say, we actually want to do something different. And eventually those people who are elected to solve problems begin to cotton on and realize that actually there might be something else that's a bit different that we can do, that they begin to catch up with what's actually happening within the population.
I couldn't agree with you more. And that was a beautiful summary of why I admire you and your position. My concern, I totally buy into that. And I would probably be happy if there was a clear vision of what's going to be in 3 generations' time, 4 generations' time. If there was a clear view of what that is, I might even give you some of my rabbits.
Yeah.
I might be very happy to give you some of my rabbits in that environment. My problem is, and I tend to sit almost nihilistically in the middle and pick away at everything around me. My problem is that I go back to fundamental human nature and see that all of this that we've discussed up until now, all of the discussion about the myth of certainty and our need for certainty, so we build it and we build it with capitalism, we could build it with money, and we build it with all sorts of numbers of rabbits and so on and so forth. That whole thing about striving, everything we've discussed that brings us to today, it leads me to believe that we don't have the will, we don't see the need, we don't have the enough worldview, we don't have enough of Steve Flats in the world to actually make it happen. And therefore, and I, as a representative of the people, if you like, I look at my own weaknesses and say, why should I give you my bloody rabbits, pal? When there's no vision of the future, where what I'm living in now, 4 generations from now, it's going to be the same. And frankly, I don't know that you're right.
Okay, let's go back to you and your 1 rabbit per day in the cave. And then you realize that actually, if I get 4 rabbits, I'm all right for 4 days. But then your neighbor notices that you've got 4 rabbits, and you've begun to develop an industrial way of harvesting rabbits. And that's taken you a little while to achieve that. So you're achieving more rabbits. Your neighbor then begins to achieve more rabbits. And then suddenly, because you're harvesting too many rabbits, there's no bloody rabbits. What you're saying is, I'll keep what I've got simply because I want it, but your neighbor also wants it. And as a result, there aren't the resources there for you to have more than is necessary. And then the whole thing falls to pieces.
Right, and what I'm saying is that until it falls to pieces, I still think that 4 rabbits is the thing to go for.
Okay.
I've got to see and feel the threat. I've got to experience the loss because my nature is such. Everything about me has taken me to this point. Hence the question at the very beginning of our chat today, that I've become addicted to having 4 rabbits, and you can't take those off me, pal. You really have got to struggle. If you can show me that I can have a sustainable, if you can show me that 4 rabbits will lead to no rabbits, I might then comfortably give you a rabbit so that I can sustainably have 3.
Actually, rather give it to me, give it to somebody who's in need of a rabbit.
Yeah, but you've got to get me to believe that it's unsustainable.
Yeah, I understand that. Carl Sagan, back in the 1970s, famous astronomer, he was once philosophizing about why there'd never been any extraterrestrial contact with human beings, bearing in mind that there are an awful lot of other planets and stars and things that have been around a lot longer than the sun. And he kind of mused on the idea that actually intelligence is self-destructive.
That could go in all sorts of places, couldn't it?
Absolutely. And so as a result, because we have intelligence, we actually destroy ourselves, because until we learn wisdom and how to manage our resources, we kill ourselves off. And I think that the planet at the present time is displaying a certain degree of distress at the human activity upon its surface.
Yeah, and what I'm saying is that until it's too late, effectively what I'm saying is until it's too late, this is going to carry on unless you can find a way of making me see that in a tangible way that makes me give you one of my rabbits. Or 3,000 or 1,000 of them, or whatever.
Yeah.
I've forgotten the currency we're dealing in now.
Well, that's inflation for you in rabbit currency.
Because we're so hardwired to think in this way. We're all sitting here describing this potential calamity in the context of a wired view of money, effectively, or goods, services, whatever you want. Your analogy of the oil company, it's wired into us. To shift it, it needs a massive shift, and I don't think the pandemic will do it. I remember Cheryl saying to me when the planes flew into the World Trade Center in America, the world will change, and I said no, it won't, and it didn't. So at the beginning of the pandemic, so many people in Western society in Britain were sending around tweets of love and care and how it's all going to change and we're all going to have this feeling of social society and cohesion and everything else. And what are we doing now? We're competing even harder with each other than we were 6 months ago, and we're still in the middle of the pandemic.
Yeah, well...
Christmas lasts for a day and a half. We let people in and we're all kind to each other, and a day and a half later, we're back to where we were. That is my fundamental problem, sitting in the middle of this nihilistic discussion. Human nature stops us. And it's a glim position to be in.
It is. Maybe there's a difference here between optimism and realism. And I won't use the word pessimism. But you can if you like.
Interesting. Well, I've got enough rabbits, so I'm not pessimistic.
No, exactly. That's why I use realism.
Yeah, and that's it. To sell the product, you've got to have a realism. In other words, you have to have the acceptance that all the myths that we've created today around money are myths.
Yeah.
And you have to create that uncertainty. And to do so, you're going to have to take us all mentally to a place that we can't cope as things stand, and look at the mental health issues that the pandemic have brought. You go around telling people that not only that, pal, but it's going to be a lot worse. And we're all going to scream and shout at you and say, bring, that's why I want President Trump, and that's why I want Boris, and that's why I want the bloody populist idiots that people are electing at the moment.
Yeah, because they offer a myth of certainty.
Do they offer the myth of through strength?
Yes.
Through power.
Yeah. I can walk up these stairs, but I'm out of breath at the top.
Yeah, and frankly, if the weak die in the process, that's fine. because you're not weak. And you're in my tribe, and therefore we'll prosper because you're in my tribe. So even if you are weak, vote for me because my tribe will prosper. Be on my side. And if the others perish as a result, then that's better for society.
Yeah, it reduces the numbers. Great. We don't have to look back very far to see what happens around that.
So what we have to do for the next chat is we have to find out how we can tell the population that it's unsustainable without putting them in a mental state that means they can't cope.
Well, this is where psychology becomes interesting, because we're seeing politics becoming more and more polarized. I mean, the States is a very good example of this. And the thing is that they're just shouting at each other, and we're looking at the madness of crowds who are only listening to the echo chamber of their own arguments. And they're taking positions instead of actually recognizing that those people on that side, whether it's Trump or Johnson or Bolsonaro or anybody else, they actually have a viewpoint. They are a human being. And that there are people then at the other side, say Jeremy Corbyn and
somebody else.
Oh, lots of Miliband's father, who was the peer that died recently, very famous.
You're not asking me for a name.
No, never mind. It's frustrating because he's probably one of the most famous socialists of all times, and it's now completely eluded me. But the thing is that whether you take sides or not, all these people have positions, and that's the real difficulty, is that they take a position and then they refuse to review the position of the other person. They refuse to review whether or not they might actually have some validity. And that's where this value of one comes in.
And that is a micro problem. It is a problem, but it's a micro problem. The macro problem is we have an unsustainable model.
Yeah.
And getting people to buy the solution, there are a number of elements to getting people to buy the solution. But in the first instance, you have to establish the need. And it doesn't matter that we're locked in echo chambers or anything else, really. Because even if you're in an echo chamber, but you accept that there is a problem that needs a solution,
but
then you'll align yourself to people that will provide the solution. But if you're sitting there thinking there isn't a problem because for whatever reason.
Oh, I think you're wrong. And the reason that I brought up this idea of madness of crowds is because what happens is you get this cognitive dissonance. You get people who are unable to change their position because they are so much in these positions that what I was going to finish off saying was that you don't start there arguing with them and telling them that they're wrong. What you have to do is you have to be, and you're absolutely right. I'm agreeing with you in the sense that we need to present a new model that is more sustainable, that people on both sides can buy into.
Right, and that's what climate change has done. Climate change is the model. Yes, it's still evolution, not revolution.
Yeah.
But there has been a significant shift in the acceptance that the planet isn't sustainable in terms of resources, and climate change is the result of our actions, and therefore we have to do something about it. And very few people will say that climate change is a myth. Very few people now. Whereas only 20 years ago, the amount of people that were like either didn't care or were denying it were significant. Now that there is an example of where you have explained and effectively achieved the need. Now, there's still a debate about how to go about it and what we do about it and everything else, but at least people are sitting there saying there is a need, and schools have done it and all of those things. Because actually, whilst it was how you go about it was political, but the facts were there. And what it's done is introduced a low level of anxiety amongst younger people, but they believe that there is a solution. They know what the solution is. They need to live slightly differently and so on and so forth. So they will cope, and that slight low level anxiety will actually bring about change. So they've found a way of communicating it. My question, and I'm going to have to go soon, but it's a good place to go, is how do we establish the need, in the same way as climate change, in the Western world, for significant structural change to the way in which we look after each other as a society? I think that's, and I'm saying that that's massive. That is massive. I'm not saying it's impossible.
Agreed. What I would say is I agree with every word you've said. I think the one step that I would take beyond what you're saying is that things like shift in fuel management, power, and I mean electrical source power or other forms of power, the need to protect the planet, the need to create sustainable food sources and materials of all sorts. These are actually the things that are going to create that kind of structural change that you're saying that we need to develop.
Right, and I'm saying it's the psychological shift that's required for climate change is very helpful and is starting to happen. And it's a psychological shift. It goes to the very root of how much we can cope with in terms of the myth of certainty. 40 years ago, we were certain that we would have fossil fuels forever and that it wouldn't do any damage to the society and to the structures, and that it would be economically viable and that we could carry on living the lives we were. We managed over time, people have managed over time to shift that from being a certainty or a myth of certainty into okay, we've got a new certainty. It creates us to feel a little bit anxious about it, but we've got a solution, and therefore we move towards it. I think that the need to do this in terms of the capitalist model, the social model, the money, and to shift that is far greater than the how to shift climate change, but nevertheless needs doing.
And what I would say to you is, I think you're absolutely right. The psychological shift is huge, but the shift is not necessarily about money. I think money, to some extent, is a bit of a side issue, because money is just an expression, a symptom of power and influence. And what we need to be thinking about, or security, if you like, supposed security, the reality of it is that we need to shift our thinking from primitive Stone Age problem solving to 21st century solution seeking, which is where we see an outcome rather than looking at the short-term problem. So we're always looking at a longer-term solution, and all our structures and society and governance and everything else is based upon a problem-focused approach.
Right. So if it's possible for one of you or me, or the combination of remembering where we got to in this conversation, that would be a great place to talk about next time. So fundamentally, you're saying the psychological shift needs to be towards solution-focused, outcome-focused thinking from Stone Age, solving the problem focused now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's try and hang on to that in the context of this conversation and see if we can't move it on from there.
Smashing. That's cool.
Okay, do you want to close it off? Because I want to tell you about the Lake District.
Okay. Hang on a minute.